Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Yellow Gloves podcast. On this episode, we're going to be covering Christian Leroy Duncan's move to the UFC. We're going to be kind of previewing how his fight will go. We're going to look at who Christian Leroy Duncan is, his career so far, deep dive into what kind of fighter he is. I essentially want to do a breakdown of Christian Leroy Duncan because I think it's beneficial to do these for people who are listening who perhaps don't watch that much Cage Warriors, but are interested in UK MMA talent and how they're going to, transition to the UFC. So I think this is a great episode to start, and I want to do these regularly. So, if a relevant enough Cage Warriors fighter gets called up to the UFC, then we'll be doing a fighter breakdown on that fighter. And I think it's actually really cool that Christian Leroy Duncan is the first fighter that we do this on the Yellow Gloves pod, because Christian Leroy Duncan's probably the most exciting fighter in the UK that fights outside of the UFC, for my money. I think Luke Riley's definitely up there as well, but obviously still with Cage Warriors. So I think Christian Leroy Duncan's a great starting point. Before I go into actually breaking stuff down, though, I just wanted to thank everyone for all of the support on the previous episode of the pod. We did like a kind of breakdown of the San Diego Cage Warriors card. It was a bit of a crapshoot in terms of, illegitimate records, weird fighter nicknames. We had a bit of a laugh and actually managed to get around 50 downloads in the first 24 hours, which we've never gotten before. So that's pretty impressive and actually something that I'm really happy with. So it's glad to it's glad to see, what an idiot I am. I'm glad to see that people are actually enjoying the content that I'm putting out. It's not incredibly easy recording this stuff. I do have a background in audio and in podcasting, so it's not difficult from a technical perspective, but it's always hard when you're the only person kind of doing this or covering, Cage Warriors in a podcasting format, like exclusively Cage Warriors. Obviously, you have the Severe guys who do amazing kind of Cage Warriors breakdowns and Energized show as well. But we cover only Cage Warriors, right? And if someone gets called up to the UFC, like Christian Leroy Duncan, we will cover that. So I guess let's start with who Christian Leroy Duncan is. So Christian Leroy Duncan's a 27-year-old, 7-0 English middleweight, stands at 6'2", fights out of an orthodox stance, but switches stances a lot, and we're going to cover that in the fighter breakdown. He's the former Cage Warriors middleweight champion, defended his belt once before vacating due to his call-up to UFC London, UFC 286 in London. So 6 of his 7 wins have come via finish. Christian Leroy Duncan's a prolific finisher in the first, second, and third round. Doesn't ever seem to gas, despite, spamming so many spinning attacks and constantly having to fend off takedowns. He's quite an exciting fighter, and I think once we get into the stylistic breakdown of Christian Leroy Duncan, I think people will start to kind of appreciate that as well. He actually trains out of a small gym in Gloucester called Range Martial Arts Academy. Though small in size, they actually have some pretty cool history behind them. So the gym actually operates under the legendary Mark Weir. So anyone listening to this who doesn't know who Mark Weir is, he actually holds one of the fastest knockouts in UFC history. And he was also a massive pioneer for black MMA fighters and UK MMA fighters. He was, to my knowledge, he was the first black English fighter to ever fight in the UFC. So obviously, kudos to Mark Weir, and it's great that Christian Leroy Duncan gets to come up under his wing. And then also Christian Leroy Duncan, as part of the gym, they also have Matt Ewan, who's one of the coaches there. He's former middleweight as well, so same weight class as Christian Leroy Duncan, UK MMA vet, and also former Cage Warriors champion from the early 2000s. So despite being a small UK gym, he's surrounded by a lot of former big names in the UK MMA scene. And it definitely shows in his game. He's experienced beyond his years. He had a huge, amateur background, and we're going to talk about that. But I think it's always interesting with these fighters that don't come from big gyms, seeing what other experiences do they have? Who are they training with? Is there, something different about the way that they're training? So I think with Christian Leroy Duncan, it's great that he actually has a lot of experienced heads around him, despite not coming from like a next gen MMA or something like that. He's actually, it's a small, humble gym, but a great coaching background, which is always nice to see. In terms of his career so far, just want to give a quick snapshot before we go super in depth. So Christian Leroy Duncan debuted in late 2020, so he's only been fighting pro for about 2 years and some change, but he has a very credible and long amateur career. He fought in the IMAF scene for a good couple of years actually went 17-6 as an amateur. It's always interesting in MMA when you have guys with long amateur backgrounds, because it's not a sport that has a, it's how to put this. It's not a sport that, it's not like boxing. There isn't like a storied kind of history in being an amateur and, building your way up before you become a pro. MMA is one of those sports where some people don't even start amateur. They just go straight into pro. Or if they do the amateur, it's like 1 or 2 fights and then they're in the big leagues, right? So it's always nice to see these longer amateur careers, because what you get is you get fighters who can actually figure out who they are before they step into a cage and in a professional standing, and their record starts to matter and the money starts to matter. So I think you get that with Christian Leroy Duncan. He's very experienced despite only being 7-0 and only being a pro for 2 years. Actually, if you look at his whole catalogue of fighting, he's been fighting for a lot longer than 2 years. So I think that definitely shows in his game. In terms of his professional career, though, he's fought exclusively in Cage Warriors as a pro. He's beaten Kyle McClurkin, Lucas Marcinkowski. He's beaten Will Curry twice, Justin Moore, then won the title against Jati Milan and defended against Marian Dimitrov in late 2022. He was supposed to fight UFC veteran and former one-time Cage Warriors champion Jesse Taylor on New Year's Eve last year, but Taylor was unfortunately the victim of like a weird hit-and-run attack in London the night before the fight. So I don't want to just rattle off these names. I actually want to give you context. So let's have a deep dive. Let's look at what type of a fighter Duncan is within the context of his fights thus far. So from the get-go in his pro debut, it was very, very obvious that Duncan was going to be like this exciting and violent fighter, if nothing else, right? Against Kyle McClurkin, he opens a fight with like a series of nasty oblique kicks and front kicks. Sported a really nice upright stance as well, which we kind of soon learned to appreciate as a standard stance in all future fights. If Duncan catches a kick, expect him to explode with a spinning back elbow, and McClurkin definitely felt one of those in the first round of their fight. However, McClurkin kind of immediately exposed a bit of a chink in Duncan's armor, his takedown defense. For someone who spins and kicks so much, Duncan tends to leave himself quite susceptible to the takedown, and it was evident from the McClurkin fight that he would have to work on his defensive grappling if he wanted to make it to the top of the scrap heap in the UK, let alone internationally, which we now know that he's obviously making that step. Early in the second round, though, Duncan managed to grab a collar tie and land an uppercut on McClurkin that spelled the beginning of the end. A few kind of ferocious standing elbows later, and McClurkin was out cold. I think this debut fight is actually a great precursor for the fighter that he would eventually become, a fighter that would, eventually also become Cage Warriors middleweight champ. A violent aggressor, he has flash and panache in his game to match some of the very best, but certainly a deficiency in defending well-timed takedown attempts, I'd say it, from that first fight, right? So 3 months later, he goes ahead and fights Lucas Marcinkowski. Duncan displayed that same upright stance, delivered some nice, beautiful side kicks to the liver of Marcinkowski. And one thing that was evident in Duncan's game here was the stance switching. So I spoke about stance switching earlier, but it's actually something that would become a big part of his game and not just a stylistic adaptation to this fight, right? He wasn't just adapting to the type of fighter Marcinkowski was. This would, soon become obvious to us that this is how Duncan fights. So switching stances is great for fighters who may not always have a big technical ability in defending takedowns. Switching stances can often dissuade opposing fighters from spamming takedowns because they need to account for strikes coming from different angles and a change of position. I actually last year wrote about Siwoo Park, who's a rising fighter, female rising fighter, and I wrote at length about this. She's not a crazy technical defensive grappler, but in switching stances, she manages to give her opponents different looks that make them think twice about shooting. And I think Duncan definitely weaponizes his stance switching in the same way, because it means he can throw an array of strikes, but also it's a nice defensive mechanism to protect himself from these incessant grappling attempts. And it worked well enough against Marcinkowski. After some side kicks and front kicks from both stances, he then threw a spinning hook kick from the southpaw stance that put Marcinkowski on skates, and then before we knew it, the referee stepped in to stop the fight. Duncan's Taekwondo is an offensive marvel, man. Like, if you watch this guy fight, and if you like aggressive kickers who throw from tight and cute angles, he's definitely someone to keep an eye on. He's got a very, very exciting style, an exciting kicking game, but there's a lot of technique behind it. It's not just that he's trying to get the highlight, it's just that he naturally fights this way. It's less flash in the way of Michael Venom Page, where with MVP you've always felt like he's actively hunting the highlight reel finish. I think with Duncan, this is just a very natural way of fighting to him, and the finish just comes as a byproduct of being this offensive marvel, like I just said. I would say inarguably Duncan's best wins are against Will Curry, though, a guy he's fought twice in the space of 3 months, I think it was, after like a weird controversial finish. I'm again throwing air quotes, but we can talk about the controversy shortly. If you don't know who Will Curry is, he's a 9-2 middleweight fighter, probably will be in the UFC sooner or later. He's actually fighting for the vacant Cage Warriors middleweight title at the end of this month. But you, dear listener, if you don't know who he is, you might know him as the guy who was kind of shouting and coaching his ass off during Bukauskas's UFC return last month. He was in the corner and got a lot of praise and acclaim from, I think it was Bisping and Anik on the commentary, maybe. So back to Curry, he's a powerful grappler. He might not be the most incredibly kind of polished technical grappler, but he's very strong and he's built like a brick shithouse, for lack of a better term. And it was a good test for Duncan, right? So they were both undefeated at the time. And Duncan actually managed to share so much cage time with a fighter who's clearly very, very talented. Duncan spent a lot of the first fight displaying strong and quick hips to meet Curry's takedowns with many sprawls. Curry did eventually manage to get him down in the first fight after numerous attempts, effectively wearing Duncan down along the fence. But Duncan showed good wherewithal to immediately attack the neck and build himself back up to his feet. And I think the wherewithal is something that I'm going to touch on later, because my favorite type of fighter is the fighter that even amidst danger, or even when they know they're in uncomfortable situations, they're still mentally there and able to combat those situations. Whenever the fight was contested on the feet, though, Duncan certainly had the better of the proceedings, used his patented stance switch, which we've been talking about, regular kicks up the middle in an attempt to dissuade Curry from shooting, which again is going to become a theme the more we talk about these fights. Eventually, though, after a very, very dull first round of a lot of inactivity in the clinch from both fighters, Duncan starts the second round by just immediately charging at Curry with a flying knee. And that wobbled Curry, eventually was dropped from it, and Duncan just started unleashing unanswered strike after unanswered strike. The controversy actually comes in when the referee stops the fight. And I think it's less about the stoppage and when he stops the fight. So I'd say there's about 15 to 20 strikes that Duncan throws at Curry that are unanswered, and Curry is turtling up, and the referee should well have stepped in and stopped the fight. But I think the problem with the stoppage is that when the referee does stop the fight, Curry's already got his arms around Duncan's hips and he's building up to his feet. So clearly the fighter is still there, but he wasn't 10 or 15 strikes ago, and I think the fight could have legitimately been stopped then. So I don't think it's controversial so much as it was a late stoppage that, had bad visuals because the guy was building up, but there was a period within that striking where he looked out of it. And I think had the fight ended there, we probably wouldn't have had a rematch. But it was good that we did have a rematch, because it was actually the first time that Duncan ended up going to a decision. And we learned a lot about Duncan in that fight. So in that rematch 3 months later, Curry has moments of success, definitely, in the grappling department in the first round. Manages to wrap a heel hook on Duncan, which had him grimacing and it looked awful. But when we talk about wherewithal, this is what we talk about. Duncan was grimacing. He looked like he was, well on his way to tapping, but he starts rolling and rolling and rolling until he finds his way to the fence and builds back up to his feet. Again, for me, it's that wherewithal amidst chaos where I think Duncan impresses the most. I think if you saw a highlight reel, or even if you listen to me in this pod, because we're going to talk about striking techniques in a few minutes and some of the strikes that Duncan unleashes. And if you saw highlight reels, or if you listen to me talk, you're probably thinking this guy's just a violent meathead and someone who's just hunting highlight reel finishes. But no, I think there's a lot of defensive soundness to Duncan's game that I don't think gets enough praise, because he's such an attractive fighter to watch from a technical perspective, from, if you like violence and that spinny, that spinning shit, basically. If you love that, then Duncan's that guy. But I hope he gets a lot of praise from people for his defensive capabilities, because I don't think he does at the moment. And I hope that his time in the UFC, people actually start to open their eyes a little bit to some of the defensive capabilities he does have. But back to that second fight, it was a tight fight. In the first round, definitely Curry had the majority of the proceedings, a lot of good grappling. Apart from the heel hook, though, most of the grappling was them cancelling each other out. But in the halfway through the second round, Duncan throws this like weird spinning, not even a spinning elbow. He throws a standing elbow, right? And that cuts Curry up immediately. You see the gash open up. And this guy literally, as he throws the standing elbow, and you think, oh, cool, he's gotten Curry, immediately goes from standing elbow to spinning elbow. And then within seconds, Curry gets dropped. And Duncan follows him to the ground, tries to cinch up a Kimura, and then the second round ends. The bell goes, and effectively Curry is saved by the bell. But it's that, for me, I think what's so cool about that fight is that to go standing elbow into spinning elbow, like you have to be mad to an extent, right? He doesn't sit there and appreciate his work, which a lot of these types of fighters, where I've made the MVP comp, and I don't even want to compare them as fighters, but if you think of someone like MVP again, where sometimes he can get caught observing and enjoying his work a little bit too much on the feet. I think with Duncan, like he hits that standing elbow, smells blood, and he's like, cool, standing elbow, spinning elbow. Like I'm gonna try and kill this man with cool shit. And I think that's one of the nice facets of Duncan's game, and what makes him so enjoyable to watch. Then in the third round, Duncan landed a few flashy shots, the best of which was like a jumping, spinning back kick to the ribs of Curry, who immediately, once he felt it, shot for a takedown. Didn't manage to get it, and actually Duncan did a lot of the grappling in the third round and managed to secure that round through the grappling, through the takedowns. I think getting to see him go the full 15 minutes when we've known him to be a prolific finisher up until that point was really cool, because with these types of fighters, when they're finishing in the first and second round, you always want to know what will this fighter look like when he faces some adversity. And he certainly did in the second fight with Curry. He almost had his heel ripped off. He almost had his ankle ripped off, but he went the full 15. Gas tank was really impressive. Only time he's ever gone to a decision, actually. So it wasn't just the first, but it's actually the only time to the point of recording this that Duncan has gone to a decision. And I think, 3 rounds of anti-grappling and throwing all those high energy attacks he did, the spinning attacks, the jumping attacks, it didn't really phase him. His cardio was the same. He was fighting in the third round as if it was the first. And I think that's what makes him so impressive. He essentially won a comfortable 29-28 against one of the best 185ers in England. And he still remains the only person to ever beat Curry. So not only has he finished him, he's also won a comfortable decision. And I think those are 2 wins that are going to age really, really well, because I do think Curry is quite an exciting fighter, and probably at the end of March, when we look at breaking down the unplugged card that he's on, the BT unplugged card, we're probably going to be talking about him as the new Cage Warriors middleweight champion. So definitely a fighter of high caliber, and a great win for Christian Leroy Duncan. However, from the Justin Moore fight onwards, this is when we start to see Duncan as like a legitimate guy who can probably win a belt. He fights Justin Moore, and it's a hilarious fight, really. It's, Moore is a UK MMA vet. He's fought in Bellator as well, so some people might know him, some might not. But it doesn't really matter, right? Duncan drops him with a flying knee 15 seconds into the fight. Moore recovers really well, to his credit, but they're grappling against the fence, and then he just inexplicably decides to pull guard. I think just back in his grappling pedigree against Duncan. Duncan, happily falls into his guard, and a minute or so later manages to navigate himself to the back, jumps on Moore's back, gets the rear naked choke, his first submission win, all in less than a few minutes work. And at that point, at 5-0, we were all looking at Christian Leroy Duncan like, this guy can do it all. He can do the flashy KOs, he can go a hard 15 minutes, and he can submit people. And I think at that point is when Cage Warriors effectively decided we need to probably give this man a title shot. And I think just before we look at the title winning fight and his title defense, I think one word to describe Christian Leroy Duncan for me is clinical, right? If he finds an opening, he's going to get the finish by any means necessary. He will find an elbow, he'll sneak in an elbow, he'll sneak in a kick to the liver, he'll find something, and when he finds it, he's going to finish you. And there's no 2 ways about it. I think if there's one word to describe Christian Leroy Duncan, it would definitely be clinical. So then let's move to 2022, which was the year of Duncan. It started with the first fight in April against Jati Milan, where he had competed for his first ever Cage Warriors title shot. So Milan was 7-0, so another moment where Christian Leroy Duncan has to face another undefeated prospect. Milan had just beaten Matthew Bonner for the belt. There was 2 undefeated records going head to head, but Duncan would come out on top in what I like to call deliciously brutal fashion. Milan's the shorter, stockier fighter and has a natural grappling base, and actually took Duncan down in the first round and kept him there for, I'd say, a good 4 minutes of the round. And you look at that and you think, maybe, yes, Duncan's good with being able to stave off the takedowns, but he's not hard to get down. It's his ability to build himself back up, which is what makes him a decent anti-grappler. And I think watching that fight, when you see him get grounded for 4 minutes, you start to think, okay, maybe this guy has a few deficiencies in the grappling department. But we're never going to find out because, Milan does his grappling, doesn't manage to get the submissions in, doesn't really throw much ground and pound. Christian Leroy Duncan's very active, gives him a lot to think about off his back, constantly trying to build back up to his feet. And when the two fighters separate at the end of the first round and Milan goes back to his corner, you see him breathing heavily, you see his shoulders hunching, and you start to think Christian Leroy Duncan is going to get his hands on this man and he's going to do bad things to him. And, it was definitely a disappointing first round because we'd seen Duncan successfully stave off Will Curry for like 20 plus minutes of fighting and then goes in there against Milan and gets blanketed. But in that second round, the patented flying knee lands for Duncan early on. Milan tries to grapple but gets literally all of his shots stuffed. Duncan throws a question mark kick, which partially lands. And one of the cool things he does in this fight is he uses a lot of rear leg hip feints to kind of bait the knee and dissuade the future kind of takedown attempts. And it's the first time we'd really seen this, and it's a good wrinkle to his game that we'd see against Marian Dimitrov, which we'll talk about soon, and we're probably going to see for the rest of his career. It's a really smart way to keep your opponent guessing using the rear leg hip feints, and he actually used them to build into quite a few front kicks as well. Milan was totally frozen by all of the attacks. It was actually insane to watch. It was like genuinely like watching one of those over-the-top martial arts, like Hong Kong movies. I mean, Duncan was throwing spinning kicks to the body, hook kicks to the head, spinning elbows, and Milan was just sitting there and taking it and just like waddling his way through. And when it gets to the third round, you think, how on earth is Milan still going? And Duncan is on the cusp of greatness, on the cusp of Cage Warriors greatness, of being a title winner. And in that third round, it was his flying knee that did it. Duncan throws this beautiful, like, outside crescent kick, misses marginally, and I shit you not, because you can go and watch the highlight. And this was one of my contenders for knockout of the year in Cage Warriors last year for the Yellow Glove Awards. He throws the outside crescent kick, misses, and literally within that same sequence just leaps out of it into a flying knee. And like I promise you, I'm not making this shit up. The guy's a sheer marvel. He leaps into that flying knee and just decimates Jati Milan. And it was their third round knockout, new Cage Warriors middleweight champion. And that's kind of what would start to begin these rumors of him joining the UFC. But it wasn't the last time he'd fight in Cage Warriors. So, he waits a few months and then defends his belt against Marian Dimitrov. There's not much really to say about that one. Dimitrov was on a 10-fight winning streak, but all of his wins had been in like the Bulgarian scene. He hadn't really fought anyone of note. I think the most notable thing about him is that he was supposed to fight Fabian Edwards, brother of Leon Edwards, at Bellator, and the fight never really materialized. So he ended up fighting Christian Leroy Duncan in Cage Warriors. And man, Duncan just made him look like an amateur. Dimitrov initially avoided being a part of Duncan's highlight reel when he managed to block a 720 tornado kick. Again, guys, I'm not making these moves up. Duncan really is about that spinning shit life. Like, he really threw a 720 tornado kick and was just doing the maddest shit. Dimitrov tried for the takedowns a few times. Again, the strong hips, the rear hip feint as well. It was all there. And there was quick reactions from Duncan to keep the fight standing. And in the end, it's just the fundamentals and the spinning stuff. It's a pawing jab that, pierces the guard of Dimitrov. And then as it pierces it, Duncan engineers it into like the spinning back elbow. The spinning back elbow wobbles Dimitrov, and then it's the left hook that drops him and the ground and pound that effectively ends his night in the first round. And that's kind of Duncan's career up until this point. He's a flashy, entertaining fighter who somehow manages to also boast really sound defensive techniques to anti-grapple fairly successfully, I'd say. However, I'd say he's still susceptible to the takedown, which will always be a concern for him, especially in the UFC where you've got guys who have wrestled in college or have like really credible grappling backgrounds. So it will be an interesting one. He's got the defensive techniques for sure, but he is still susceptible to the takedown. So we'll see how that goes for him in the UFC. In terms of a stylistic comparison, because I know people enjoy that, I'd say for me, stylistically, if you're looking for a straight up comparison, I'd wager that Duncan kind of reminds me a bit of John Jones in the way that he stalks his opponent, has that really um you can't see me right now, but I've got my hand extended and I've got my shoulders really upright. He's always kind of feeling for gaps like John Jones. And actually, to be honest, Duncan also has a susceptibility to poking people's eyes, which isn't always good, but it's a nature of him, again, always having his hand extended and trying to feel for gaps as I'm still prodding my arm forward like an idiot in front of my microphone. Um, so please forgive me. His hands are always extended, right? So he's got this really nice ability to kind of feel his way into an opponent's guard. And then again, it's the elbow game, like John Jones. He'll feel his way, elbow over the top. And I'd say this is going to sound really mad, right? But I'd say if you excessively fed Ricardo Ramos and turned him into a middleweight, and then you gave him John Jones's stance, and you made him someone who's from Gloucester, England, you'd probably have Christian Leroy Duncan, right? It's the spinning stuff, it's the technical wherewithal. The grappling might not be there, right? So that's where I bring Ricardo Ramos in. The grappling, we still don't know. Can he defend takedowns? Yes. Can he build his way up from being taken down? Definitely yes. And that's what makes him less of a concern for me, but still gets taken down a bit too much for my liking. I guess the last question before I kind of wrap this up, you're probably thinking, Chris, how do you think his fight goes against Dusko Todorovic? Because that's who he's debuting against. As of me recording this, we know what MMA is like. You could be listening to this, and Christian Leroy Duncan is either not fighting or he's fighting some random person who we've never heard of. I'm going to just prognosticate this Dusko Todorovic fight. I've watched Dusko Todorovic, all of his UFC fights. He's definitely got a bit of a suspect chin for me, quite defensively porous on the feet, but he's a really good grappler, has really good ground and pound as well, could quite easily get Christian Leroy Duncan down, but can he withstand the striking? If you watch the fight between Todorovic and Njokuani, or even the fight that he had with, I want to say, was it Punahele Soriano? I think it's definitely Puna, yeah. He, again, is susceptible on the feet to getting absolutely clobbered. And if you can defend the takedown initially, he does get quite frustrated and doesn't really have his way around a fight. Probably the most notable thing about Dusko Todorovic to me is that he looks like Dustin Poirier if you just stretched Dustin Poirier out. That's exactly who he looks like to me. I can't ever unsee it. But from a stylistic standpoint, I think Todorovic definitely has the grappling advantage, but I don't think that his chin is there. And I don't think in front of a London crowd, knowing how much of a showman Christian Leroy Duncan can be, I feel like the UFC have given him a bit of a nice layup for him to get a highlight reel finish, which, if you follow the UK prospects recently, they haven't been getting much of that in the UFC. It's been, just look at Jai Herbert. Look at Jai Herbert since he's joined the UFC and look at the fighters that man has had to fight. And that should give you a good enough example of the type of fights these dudes usually have to take. But Todorovic, decent fighter. I don't think he'll be able to ground Duncan. I think if he does get Duncan down, Duncan has shown time and time again that he can get back to his feet. He's never been finished before. He's never really been in a really awful position, apart from that heel hook from Will Curry in the second fight. But he showed that he had the defensive capabilities to get himself back to his feet. So I think the stage is set for Christian Leroy Duncan. I'm predicting that he'll win. Of course, I'm biased as a UK MMA guy and someone who has probably the only Cage Warriors podcast in the whole world. I'm here for Christian Leroy Duncan. I want to see this man do well. In an ideal world, he probably breaks into the top 15 at middleweight in the UFC. I think he's going to be really exciting. I think people are going to love the way that this man fights. He's going to have a lot of highlight reel finishes. If he gets to the very top, I don't know how he does against your Hermansons, your Vittoris, these guys that are your Brunsons, guys that are going to grapple and grapple and grapple. But let's not get ahead of ourselves too much. Let's treat him as the 7-0 UK MMA prospect, former Cage Warriors middleweight champion, making his UFC debut against a guy who is hittable I think it's there for Duncan, and I really, really hope he wins. So that's it for my fighter breakdown, guys. One thing to note, I mentioned this in my previous episode, the Cage Warriors San Diego breakdown, but as of recording this, I haven't yet left the UK for Japan, but I will be. Well, I'm recording this on the 1st of March, so we are 16 days away from Christian Leroy Duncan making his debut. I will be releasing this around maybe like middle of the week of that fight week. So let's say like Wednesday or Thursday of that fight week. So, again, shit might change with this fight. If it does, apologies. But I hope that there's enough of a technical breakdown here that you can still enjoy learning about Christian Leroy Duncan and not having to worry too much about who he is fighting if it isn't Todorovic. But other than that, guys, I really appreciate everyone tuning in. If you did enjoy it, liking the podcast, leaving a comment, leaving a review, tweeting me, all of that good stuff lets me know that you're enjoying it, apart from just the arbitrary, X amount of people have downloaded something. So yeah, let me know. And other than that, hope you guys have a wonderful day, night, evening, wherever you are in the world, and take it easy.